It started like any other high-stakes televised exchange: polished lights, studio makeup, the usual buzz of anticipation in the room. But what unfolded was nothing short of surgical obliteration, a strategic dismantling that left audiences leaning in, jaws slack, and networks scrambling to clip the footage before it spread like wildfire. From the moment the first question was asked, it was clear this wasn't going to be a simple dialogue. This wasn't a back and forth. This was a chess match played by a grandmaster who had already memorized every move on the board, and his opponent hadn't even taken the plastic off the pieces. The atmosphere shifted quickly. What began as a polite engagement became an intellectual beatdown. The responses were sharp, rapid, delivered with unflinching clarity and surgical precision. Each word landed like a data-driven sledgehammer, exposing contradictions, dismantling platitudes, and lighting a fire under every empty talking point tossed across the table. There was no aggression in tone, just the cold efficiency of someone who had brought receipts, diagrams, timelines, and 10 years of research memorized down to the comma. Every statement was punctuated with real-world examples, every assumption picked apart like tissue paper under a magnifying glass. What made it devastating wasn't the volume or theatrics. It was the silence that followed each fact, each counterpoint. It was the stunned look from the moderator, who at one point visibly glanced off camera as if asking the crew, "Are we still rolling?" You could hear a pin drop between the responses. As the audience hung on each phrase, each delivery a scalpel slicing through manufactured narratives and Hollywood gloss. What's more chilling than a verbal takedown? A factual one. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The strength came from absolute certainty, the kind that comes from building rockets, rewriting the rules of finance, and flipping the entire automotive industry on its head. The confidence came not from rehearsed lines or screenwriter-fed charisma, but from lived experience, from sleepless nights in laboratories, and from global movements shaped by innovation. You could feel that weight behind each syllable, and it crushed the shallow sound bites lined up to stand against it. Every question tossed his way became a launch pad, not a trap. Complex subjects? He simplified them in seconds. Global issues? Addressed with solutions already in motion. When cornered with ideological fluff, he responded with grounded reality. When baited with hypothetical drama, he countered with measurable facts. The contrast couldn't have been starker. One man spoke with the authority of impact, the other with the tone of rehearsal. What really made it unforgettable, though, was the moment it all shifted visibly. You could see it, not just in the speaker's unrelenting clarity, but in the subtle body language across the table. There was a slump, a stutter, a glass of water raised to trembling lips. The confidence started to crack. The veneer of control began to slip. It wasn't rage or retaliation that did it. It was the slow, merciless erosion of certainty. And the crowd knew it. The studio knew it. The world watching online, they were already clipping the moment and spreading it like wildfire. The media team in the back began to murmur. A few producers leaned in toward their earpieces. Someone tapped notes on a tablet, perhaps considering the PR implications. But it was too late. The floodgates were open. It wasn't just a personal loss. It was a symbolic one. A torch passing. Moment from manufactured authority to earned intellect, from scripted prestige to disruptive truth. It wasn't just debate. It was domination, not with insults or bravado, but with logic, with poise, and with an unshakable grasp of reality. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about exposure. A peeling back of layers to reveal the substance, or lack thereof, beneath. The type of moment that doesn't just sting in the present, but echoes into the future, replayed again and again as a warning to anyone who enters a battle of ideas unprepared. From the moment the conversation began to slip out of control, it was clear that something beneath the surface had cracked. It wasn't obvious at first, just a flicker in the eyes, a slight tightening of the jaw, a nervous glance toward the studio lights. But those who watched closely saw it. The confidence that had walked onto the stage, bold and self-assured, began to crumble under the weight of something it wasn't built to withstand. The quiet, unrelenting force of truth. He tried to hold the posture, tried to smile. That signature grin, so polished, so practiced, was stretched across his face like a last line of defense. But it wasn't real. You could see it. It didn't reach the eyes. Behind that grin was a storm of panic, calculations spinning too fast, a mind trying desperately to find a lifeline in a conversation that had veered completely off script. The carefully rehearsed charisma that had carried him through countless interviews, red carpets, and press junkets began to falter in real time. The smile stayed, but the hands betrayed him, fidgeting, adjusting the cuff, tapping the table, clinging to anything tactile as if it could ground him. Each moment that passed dragged him further from safety. The exchanges were no longer friendly or flattering. They were clinical, sharp, and utterly unsympathetic. Questions came that had no pre-approved answers. Assertions were met not with applause, but with calm, relentless contradiction. And each time he tried to steer the conversation back into familiar territory, talking points, charm, anecdotes, it was dragged back into a realm where only substance mattered, and substance was running low. There was a moment, brief, but telling, when the mask nearly slipped entirely. A single breath, held too long, a pause, not for effect, but because there was simply nothing to say. His mouth opened, but the words stumbled out awkwardly, a weak deflection laced with forced humor that landed like a lead balloon. No laughter came, no knowing nods, just silence. A silence that said more than any insult ever could. His usual energy, the thing that once made rooms feel smaller and cameras feel closer, was gone. In its place was something raw, unpolished, human. And not the kind of humanity that builds connection, but the kind that reveals vulnerability, the kind that shows the seams. His posture began to shift. Less upright, less controlled. The confident lean became a stiffened arch. He stopped making eye contact. Instead, his gaze drifted downward, then sideways, avoiding the steady gaze, across the table like a boxer who knows he's outmatched but refuses to throw in the towel. And then came the sweat. Not the kind you'd expect under bright lights, but the kind born of pressure, the kind that forms when your narrative is unraveling in real time and you have no tools to stitch it back together. He dabbed at his face with a handkerchief that appeared almost from nowhere, as if it had been waiting in the wings for this exact collapse. His voice, usually smooth, magnetic, began to crack. Phrases were repeated, points reworded 3 different ways, all leading nowhere. It was like watching someone lost in a maze they'd built themselves. This wasn't an outburst. There was no explosion of anger or storming off the set. That might have preserved a shred of control. No, this was far worse. A slow unraveling, a quiet, visible disintegration of composure that was impossible to ignore. The more he tried to pull himself together, the more apparent it became that the battle was already lost. Every attempted comeback only highlighted the lack of real footing. Every nervous laugh only deepened the contrast between appearances and reality. The audience could feel it. You could see the shift in their body language, the way they leaned back, crossed arms, exchanged glances. They weren't watching an argument anymore. They were witnessing a collapse, and not the theatrical kind designed for ratings. This was something far more unsettling. The realization that beneath the sparkle and polish was a man entirely unprepared for a confrontation that didn't play by the old rules. No applause could save him. No ad-libbed charm offensive could turn the tide. The tide had already turned. The smile stayed like a mask held in place by shaking hands, but it had become a caricature of its former power. And behind it, for the first time in a long time, from the moment the conversation veered into deeper territory, the air shifted. It wasn't about showmanship anymore. The spotlight moved away from personalities and landed squarely on ideas. Ideas that had been sitting dormant in the shadows, waiting for the right voice to drag them into the light. And in that moment, that voice arrived. Not loud, not bombastic, but razor-sharp and calm, ready to cut through layers of distraction with precision. He didn't posture or dance around. the subject. He went straight for the core. The words weren't just criticisms, they were revelations. Layer by layer, the facade of an industry known for its glitz and gloss was peeled back, revealing something far more calculated underneath. It wasn't just about fame. It wasn't just about entertainment. It was about control, influence, the quiet shaping of public opinion through curated images and tightly managed narratives. Names weren't dropped carelessly. Each one was placed with intent. Dates, deals, timelines. There was no speculation, only evidence, laid out with the confidence of someone who had studied the system from the outside and seen its inner workings from the inside. He spoke of contracts, written to silence dissent, partnerships designed to preserve illusion, and decision-making circles where truth was considered a liability. The kind of things whispered in back rooms were now being said aloud, in front of cameras, with receipts ready to go. The effect was immediate. The host, clearly unsettled, tried to redirect the conversation. A joke here, a question there. Anything. To soften the blow. But there was no room for detours. The speaker was on a mission, and every sentence pushed the conversation further into uncomfortable territory. Words like gatekeeping, narrative enforcement, and social engineering began to echo through the studio. This wasn't a conspiracy rant. It was a systematic breakdown of how perception is manufactured and why dissenting voices are either molded or erased. What caught everyone off guard was the clarity. There was no rage, no hysteria, just a chilling calm. He wasn't trying to convince anyone through emotion. He didn't need to. He brought facts. He brought examples, interviews, leaked memos, moments that everyone remembered but never questioned. Now given new context, darker implications. The entertainment world, long seen as harmless fantasy, was reframed as something far more strategic, a culture machine, a soft power weapon aimed inward, turning audiences into obedient spectators of their own manipulation. And it wasn't just about movies or media. The implications stretched further, into education, into politics, into the normalization of behaviors that decades ago would have sparked outrage. Now, they were packaged as progressive, forward-thinking, inclusive. But he argued they were something else entirely, engineered obedience, Pavlovian conditioning disguised as enlightenment. And while the room tried to stay composed, you could feel the discomfort growing. There was truth here. Too much truth. Then came the data. Viewership numbers that didn't add up. Social media engagement manipulated by bots and algorithmic. Prioritization. Funding sources that connected supposedly grassroots movements to the same handful of billionaire donors. This wasn't guesswork. These were patterns, repeatable, trackable, and damning. A web of influence laid bare, spun by a handful of players with reach that extended far beyond the studio lots of California. The most powerful moment came when he pointed out the silence. Not what's said, but what's never allowed to be said. The list of untouchable topics, the stories that get killed before they're written, the careers that vanish after one wrong tweet. The unspoken rules everyone in the industry knows but no one dares to confirm. Until now. And here they were, being spoken out loud, on live television, without apology. The response wasn't explosive, it was stunned. For a few moments, no one spoke. Not the host, not the audience, not the panelists. It was as if a spell had been broken, a curtain yanked back to reveal the machinery behind the magic. Some looked angry, some looked scared, a few looked relieved, because deep down, they knew. Everyone knew. They had just never heard it articulated with such clarity, and certainly not in front of millions of viewers. And that's when it became clear this wasn't just a discussion. It was a line in the sand, a warning shot, a challenge not just to individuals but to institutions. And for the first time in a long time, the story wasn't scripted. It was real, raw, uncontrolled, and it was spreading. The moment the broadcast ended, something shifted behind the scenes. It was subtle at first, a quiet scrambling in the production booth, muted voices over earpieces, a few executives suddenly pacing with phones glued to their ears. The broadcast had gone live without a hitch, but what had been said during those few minutes had landed like a seismic event in the control rooms of media networks and boardrooms of PR firms. You could feel it, even before the cameras cut. There was a kind of silence, not the silence of reflection, but the silence of calculation, of damage control. It didn't take long before the footage began to disappear. Clips that had been instantly uploaded to official social media pages were quietly pulled down. Links that had already gone viral were suddenly broken, marked as unavailable, or removed by the uploader. Independent accounts that tried to repost it found themselves shadow banned, throttled, or outright suspended. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a coordinated sweep, a digital purge carried out with alarming speed and precision. People noticed. The internet moves fast, and erasure only fuels curiosity. Where did it go? Why did it vanish? What was so dangerous about a conversation that someone, somewhere, decided it needed to be scrubbed from the record? The more the footage disappeared, the more people started digging. Screen recordings resurfaced, transcripts leaked, alternate uploads were passed around in encrypted chats in anonymous forums. Each deletion only amplified the reach. What followed next was the familiar pattern. The headlines came out, but not to report what was said. Instead, they attempted to reframe it. Articles spun the moment as a misunderstanding, a controversial opinion, a viral gaffe. Carefully written editorials worked overtime to blur the focus, redirecting attention to tone, personality, or irrelevant distractions. Not a word about the substance. Not a word about the truths revealed. It wasn't journalism, it was triage. A desperate effort to reassert the narrative before it slipped too far out of their grasp. Behind closed doors, the machine went into overdrive. Calls were made. Alliances were activated. Experts appeared on panels within hours to dismiss the moment as conspiratorial or irresponsible, despite none of them directly addressing the points made. Social media platforms tweaked their algorithms, burying any posts that included specific keywords. Fact-checking websites, often funded by the very entities implicated in the discussion, issued vague rebuttals filled with technicalities and omissions. The goal wasn't to disprove, it was to confuse, to overwhelm, to flood the public square with noise. But it was too late. The moment had already happened. Millions had seen it live. More were seeing it through bootleg clips and second-hand accounts. And the truth, once spoken clearly and publicly, cannot be unheard. For many, it was the first time they'd seen someone speak that way. Not with hesitation, not with careful calibration, but with brutal, unfiltered honesty. It was a rupture, a crack in the facade that had for so long passed as reality. And no matter how fast the machine moved, it couldn't uncrack what had already broken. That's when the ripple effects began. People started asking questions, not just about what had been said, but about why the reaction to it had been so extreme. Why such a coordinated effort to silence? What were they trying to protect? And if the institutions reacted this way to one person speaking openly, what else had they hidden? The illusion of transparency was shattered, and beneath it, something far more unsettling emerged. A realization that the public narrative is not as organic as it seems. The censorship backfired. What was meant to erase only amplified. What was meant to control only provoked rebellion. And what was meant to be forgotten became a rallying point. A flashpoint in the growing divide between manufactured reality and the raw, unfiltered truth. People are beginning to crave. It wasn't just about one interview or one exchange, it was about what it exposed, about the system itself, and the desperate, frantic measures it will take to preserve its illusion of control. And so, after all the scrambling, the censorship, the media gymnastics, and the coordinated silencing, what remains isn't just the memory of a confrontation, it's a shift in awareness. A line was crossed, not with rage or scandal, but with truth. And truth, once spoken boldly and without apology, leaves a scar on the systems built to suppress it. That's what makes this moment more than entertainment, more than a viral clip, more than just another headline in the endless scroll of noise. What happened wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of two worlds colliding, one built on illusion, the other rooted in reality. When that collision took place, the force didn't come from volume or emotion. It came from facts, calmly delivered and utterly unmovable. It came from a refusal to play by the unspoken rules that govern conversations in curated spaces. And, in breaking those rules, something real was revealed about the people, the platforms, and the powers that shape what we're allowed to see and hear. This wasn't just about one person being challenged. It was about an entire industry being confronted, about institutions being forced for a few minutes to reckon with the fact that control is slipping, that the public is not as easily manipulated as it once was, that the hunger for authenticity is growing louder than the distractions designed to smother it, and that when someone steps into that spotlight with the courage to say what isn't supposed to be said, the echo reaches further than any PR campaign can counter. What follows now won't be led by studios or executives. It won't come from celebrity statements or carefully crafted apologies. It will come from people, regular people, who saw what happened, who felt something crack, and who won't settle for the version of reality being handed to them. The genie is out of the bottle, and no amount of spin can put it back in. Institutions that once demanded trust have been caught off guard, exposed not through scandal, but through clarity. It may have been just a few minutes on live television, but in those minutes, a mirror was held up, not to the audience, but to the system itself. And what it saw was something it wasn't ready to face, a world where its narratives are no longer safe from challenge, where its silence speaks louder than its noise, and where its control is no longer absolute. That's the legacy of that moment, not the argument, not the fallout, but the awakening. The realization that truth doesn't need permission, and once it breaks through, no amount of deletion can make people forget what they finally saw for